Welcome to the Hire Truckers Podcast, where we interview experts in driver recruiting. We provide industry insights, marketing trends, and motivation to help you level up your recruiting game.
Welcome to the Hire Truckers Podcast. I'm your host, Ginger Craddock. Every mile of freight from port to a warehouse to a neighborhood store is connected by a chain. And when that chain gets pulled by trade policy, every link feels the strain. I wonder if you've been feeling the strain. Tariffs. They sound like something that happens in Washington. But for truckers, retailers, ranchers, and consumers, tariffs show up in prices, in paychecks, and in the cost of keeping America moving. So good news. Today, we're joined by someone who understands every layer of this chain, from the port to the policymaker. Jonathan Gold is the Vice President of Supply Chain and Customs Policy at the National Retail Federation, where he represents the retail industry before Congress and the administration on issues of supply chain, trade, and product safety. Before joining NRF, John served inside government as a U.S. Customs and Border Protection in that department, working on cargo security and the Safe Port Act and trades facilitation. Now, he's advised multiple federal agencies from the Department of Commerce to Homeland Security, and he's spent years helping shape America's approach to global trade. So in short, when it comes to understanding how tariffs move from policy to price tags, John Gold is the voice to listen to. And I could not be more excited to have John on the podcast today. John, welcome to the Hire Truckers Podcast.
Thanks, Ginger. It's great to be here today.
Excellent. So, John, you've been in the middle of these trade discussions for years, from both the private sector and inside government. And today we're going to unpack that topic that affects everyone listening, whether they're moving freight or managing a business: tariffs. So first, what are they? How do they work? And why does it matter to people today?
Thanks, Ginger. I think that's a great place to start. And I think it's really important to understand the basics, because even now there's still a lot of confusion with exactly what tariffs are and what they do. So, I think as a starting point, it's important for folks to understand that, essentially a tariff is a tax that is paid by the U.S. importer. It is applied when those shipments arrive here in the United States. Customs and Border Protection will collect the money from the importer for that entry, and typically happens, within 15 to 30 days of that container or product arriving here in the United States, and it goes right into the general treasury. So I know there's a lot of discussion of, either a foreign country or a foreign company is going to pay the tariff, but that's just simply not the case. It's the U.S. importer themselves who pays that tariff.
Wow. So can you give the intent behind the tariffs and how the recent administrations have used them?
Sure. So, look, tariffs have been around since the country was founded. It was, initially a way to pay for government operations, but we've certainly moved away from that, especially over the last, 100 years or so, where you've seen kind of the economy significantly increase. You've gone to the income tax to pay for government operations. There's been some talk of using tariffs to pay for the, funding the government. We can't tariff ourselves enough to pay for the government right now. I think, when you look at how President Trump has been using the tariffs, it's important to recognize that he ran on tariffs as part of his campaign. He talked about throughout his campaign using a 10 to 20% global tariff on everybody, and then a specific 60 to 100% tariff on China. And, we've kind of gone through this before with President Trump. During his first administration, we had the China Section 301 tariffs specifically on China, 25% tariffs. Part of that was because of, China's acts and policies towards the United States and trade. And I think, when you talk about tariffs do have an important part to play in trade policy. They can be used correctly when you have, a specific industry who's being disadvantaged. There are lots of different trade rules you can use to help domestic industries if they're being harmed. But the way the tariffs today are being applied are on everything and everyone. This administration has moved forwards on tariffs because they think we're being taken advantage of by so many different countries. They look at the current trade deficit in a negative light, even though the fact we've had a trade deficit for, going on 50 years. But that doesn't mean that we're not successful, we're not productive, we're not, winning in the trade space when you look at how we do on services trade. But everything has been tied to that, the trade deficit and trying to bring that down. So, we've had a number of different tariffs being put in place. And, I know as we'll get into, there's still ongoing uncertainty on those tariffs for a variety of different reasons. But right now, the tariffs are far and wide and hitting, everything and everyone who's importing products into the United States, not just finished goods, but also inputs to production, which hurt U.S. manufacturers.
Absolutely. So why do tariffs often sound good politically, but they create complex economic consequences?
Yeah, I think they sound good because you think you're punishing somebody overseas when that typically is not the case, again, because it's the importer who pays that tariff. And the other challenge here, too, is that eventually, even though it's the U.S. importer who pays, eventually those costs make their way through the supply chain down to the ultimate consumer. So you do see prices, increase as a result of these tariffs. So again, when used focused in a strategic manner, they're probably better suited and will hopefully have some strategic gain. But the way they're being applied right now, unfortunately, we don't see that as being the case.
And so let's continue to unpack that the way that tariffs are unfolding now. So let's talk about what's actually playing out on the ground. How are the tariffs impacting businesses, both large, small, trucking, the end consumer? I'm a rancher in Texas. How is this playing out on the ground in today's environment?
Sure. So, obviously this all started when, the president took office on January 20th. There was a lot of expectation that he was going to put tariffs in place on day one because of how he ran the campaign and the constant talk about tariffs. We didn't get that on day one. What we did get was the America First Trade Policy Memo, which was kind of a pathway to eventually getting to tariffs, where the president wanted, all the key administration departments to look at our trade policies, our engagement with our trading partners, what's working, what's not, and then how we can use tariffs and other trade tools to better align kind of where his thinking on trade. From there, we then got the initial Mexico and Canada tariffs because of fentanyl and border-related issues that also included China. They were put in place, then they were delayed for 30 days as they were having negotiations, and then they were put in place on Canada. The China tariffs were increased, and then we got a further delay on Mexico, which continues today. And then we had a bit of another kind of backtrack as they said that anything that qualifies under the U.S., Canada, Mexico agreement wouldn't be subject to those tariffs. So that's roughly about 85% of trade that's not subject to those tariffs. But then moving forwards, we got in April Liberation Day, which was the big announcement that the president made on the global reciprocal tariffs that was going to be placed on everybody. It started as a 10% tariff, and then, if everybody remembers, the big chart he rolled out into the Rose Garden that had about 60 or so countries with higher tariff rates that were going to take effect a few days later. They then punted on that for 90 days because all these countries were going to come and negotiate these great trade deals. We were supposed to get 90 deals in 90 days. Unfortunately, that didn't occur. We got a few trade agreements or framework agreements that are still being worked on now. But in addition to those major tariff announcements, we then had a rash of announcements on sectoral tariff investigations, starting with steel and aluminum. And that was a kind of holdover from the first administration, where they then increased the tariffs from 25% to 50% and got rid of all the previous exclusions and exemptions that countries had been given. So during the first administration, they had what is known as an exclusion process, where you as a company could go and petition to get your specific products off of that list if you provided some reasoning why you couldn't make it here, wasn't available here in commercial quantities and things like that. With the new steel and aluminum tariffs, they removed all of that, removed any agreements that the countries had, and just put these the flat fees back in place, and then increased those to 50%. And then from there, we had copper, then autos and auto parts, We just had the lumber and furniture and cabinets and vanities tariffs went into effect. We've got ongoing investigations on semiconductors, on a whole wide variety of different products. They just announced investigations into personal protective equipment and medical consumables, on robotics. It's about a dozen or so of these investigations that are more sector specific to put tariffs in place. Again, trying to protect domestic industry. But again, as we know, the downstream impact is that, it tends to hurt the end consumer at the end of the day because those costs get passed on.
It really does. And so thinking about the trucking industry, we haul all the things that you've mentioned. In the trucking industry, it's like everything's on a truck at some point in its life cycle to the end consumer. And so thinking about the companies we serve that we are picking freight up from, each of those sectors you mentioned, we've got big rigs backing up, picking up freight for them. So what are you hearing from the retailers, and what are you hearing from the carriers in the supply chain?
Absolutely. So I think the other part on the carriers too is that it's not just the freight that they're carrying, but they just announced new tariffs on heavy trucks. So that again is going to have a big impact on the trucking industry. They're talking about tariffs on chassis and things like that. So that has another impact on the industry. But specifically on the retailers, look, retailers use global supply chains to bring, the best quality products for the best, most affordable prices for consumers. So anything that impacts that pricing certainly has an impact on retailers and their consumers. Retail profit margins are 2 to 3%. So anything that impacts that certainly is a challenge. And we've seen that with the tariffs that have been put in place. The ongoing uncertainty as tariffs are increased, decreased, delayed, put on hold, just the uncertainty of what's coming next for retailers who are planning their supply chains anywhere from 6 to 9 months in advance, trying to figure out how this tariff policy impacts the products they're bringing in, the pricing of what they're bringing in, as retailers look to mitigate the impacts of the tariffs. If, one of the stated goals of this administration was for companies to diversify away from China, which was, a goal during the first administration. And many companies took that advice and went to move their products out of China. But then they moved to countries like Vietnam, India, Indonesia, and others who, when the reciprocal tariffs were announced, got higher tariff rates than China. So for these companies, like, why am I making the change then if these other countries are going to have higher tariff rates than China? So you saw some, folks moving back to China. But the challenge in the day is, again, looking at the supply chain, trying to figure out, how and when to order. When we had back in April, the reciprocal, announcements, and at that point, the president upped the pressure on China to 145% because they retaliated against the U.S. We had many companies who just stopped buying from China because they couldn't afford that tariff rate. That was essentially a ban on Chinese products. So you have many small businesses who said, I can't order because I'm the one stuck with the bill when the product arrives here, and I don't have the cash on hand to pay that tariff. So for the month of April through early May, a lot of folks cut back, if not stopped, any ordering from China. And the important part there is that that's when companies are making their holiday decisions. That's when they're ordering all their holiday merchandise that has to come in be on the shelves in November and December for the winter holidays. So that has a significant impact on companies as they're, again, planning, trying to figure out, where am I sourcing from? What am I sourcing? How much am I buying? Because one of the challenges here, too, is that folks are reducing the quantity and the types of products they're bringing in. So, we certainly hope that, product will be there on the store shelves when consumers go shopping. The options might not be as many as they had thought they were going to be, but, product will be there. But that's all something folks are thinking about. And especially for smaller businesses who don't have the leverage and the opportunity like the bigger guys do to mitigate some of these tariff impacts, it's a real challenge. And we've heard from many of our small businesses who are really concerned that they're going to have to close up shop because they can't afford the increased rates with the tariffs.
And the thing that I'm hearing from you is not only the impact of the tariffs and the pain points when they're instituted, But there's this gap that includes chatter of it may be this or it may be that. As a business owner or as a real estate investor, let's look at real estate. As a business owner, as real estate, I'm projecting out on projects. And so I'm looking at the supply chain for lumber, HVAC, the things that come with building commercial developments. So what does it look like in that sector? Are these tariffs just related to national security products, or am I safe with lumber and construction? I think I know the answer to that. Unpack it for me.
No, it's certainly the challenge here is the uncertainty, which continues today, of knowing kind of what's coming next and just what's in place today. Because, you've got things that happen on social media where the president will make an announcement. He threatened 2 weeks ago that we were going to have an additional 100% tariff on China starting on November 1st. And then yesterday we had the deal that was made with China where that's not going to happen. And we're actually going to reduce the fentanyl related tariffs in half. But again, things can happen on a whim. I mean, we have the ongoing fight now with Canada. They ran an ad over the weekend using Ronald Reagan's statements on trade and tariffs. And the president got upset by that and said, we're not going to hit Canada with an additional 10% tariffs. We don't know if that's going to take effect, when that's going to take effect. So trying to plan accordingly makes it extremely difficult to do that. And I think, one of the issues I keep telling my members is, we've got to wait until we see official documentation, official announcements. Just because something is said on social media doesn't mean it's going to happen at that point in time. You've got to wait until you see the official White House proclamation or the deal or something like that before understanding that. And then hopefully once that comes out, then you quickly get the guidance from U.S. Customs and Border Protection on how this all actually gets implemented. But part of the challenge is sometimes they'll make an announcement and implementation comes, a day or two later, where you haven't had time to adjust and make the proper steps to make sure you're doing it the right way. But again, going back to your question about kind of the national security aspect of this, that's where the Section 232 tariffs come into effect, because they're really supposed to be used for national security purposes. But as we saw with the steel and aluminum tariffs and how they do this, what they call the inclusion process, where companies can petition to have their products placed on the list, domestic industries petition to get their products on the list, the expansion of the HTS lines that are covered go well beyond what's there for national security purposes. I mean, this latest round where they're talking about, canned food products being subject to these additional tariffs, which, again, why is that a national security thing? And then going back again, we just had the lumber and furniture tariffs that were announced. Again, is upholstered furniture a national security threat? Or bathroom vanities and kitchen cabinets a national security threat? I would argue no. But that's, kind of where this administration is going with some of these tariffs. And there's more to come. We certainly know that that's the case.
And when I think about other goods and services that we're hauling in the trucking industry, and I'm a Texan, big in Texas is we're hauling fuel and gas. Mm-hmm. Most fuel and gas companies in Texas have partnerships in Canada. Also, the beef industry. So what kind of chatter, what things are you hearing related to those products? Because typically this administration has been friendly to Texas and there's been some similar mindset, but that's not what I'm hearing at the feed store recently related to cattle. My ranching neighbors are not happy.
Right. So, one of the things that we haven't talked about yet is obviously the impact on U.S. exports. Primarily, ag and beef and others. And the challenge there is that when we put these high tariffs on our trading partners, they then turn around and retaliate against the United States, especially China, where, they stop buying soybeans for, a long period of time. Just yesterday, they announced they're going to buy now because of the deal. But, the soybean farmers were in real bad shape early on because they weren't buying. Chinese weren't buying. They went to Brazil to buy soybeans as opposed to the United States. There's recent discussions now on the beef issue where we're going to import Argentinian beef into the United States to address beef prices. And I know the cattlemen were not happy about that. And I think most of these folks, our exporters want to get markets overseas. And what these tariffs do, unfortunately, is the retaliation. It shuts off some of those markets overseas. And while there are some discussions of, giving a bailout or something to these exporters, I know they would prefer the market overseas as opposed to getting, a bailout back here at home. Because the challenge is once you lose that market overseas, it's very difficult to get it back. And we've seen that time and time again.
Yeah. Customer acquisition, no matter what business you're in, customer acquisition is a big expense, and it's a whole lot easier to retain a customer and serve a customer and deepen that relationship than it is to lose and get somebody new. Yes, from a business standpoint.
And the other impact too on the farmers too, it's not just on the export side, but on the import side, think about all the equipment needs they have and the price impact to equipment that now is we're seeing with equipment becoming more expensive, the parts and components becoming more expensive, fertilizer becoming more expensive, all because of the tariffs. So they're kind of getting hit on that double whammy, unfortunately.
Yes. And my ranching neighbors were struggling with the expenses of fertilizer way before tariffs entered the conversation. And they're like, we're not going to be able to run cattle anymore because our supplies are outpacing what we can get for a head of beef. And so they kind of like in the trucking industry, freight rates versus hauling, there's a lot of constriction in multiple industries.
Now let's take a minute to thank today's sponsor. Do you hire truck drivers in hard to fill areas, or do you need help creating efficiency in your recruiting department? You're not alone. With 50 plus years experience, Trucking Click specializes in data-driven strategies, industry-leading customer experience, and custom solutions that'll get you to your goal. Trucking Clicks is your go-to place for high-quality, direct leads at scale. Visit truckingclicks.com or call 512-982-0816 today.
So, John, you've done a great job of helping us kind of see big picture pain points. And how it impacts everybody along the chain is impacted. So now let's pivot and let's talk about mitigation strategies. So you've been working closely with businesses through the National Retail Federation. What are some ways that companies are trying to mitigate the impact of tariffs?
Sure. So, one of the things that we've been doing is we made sure our members were, kind of fully up to date, up to speed, and kind of what was coming and what was going to happen. Even prior to the election, we started talking about the tariffs just because the ongoing threat of what candidate Trump had been talking about with the tariffs. So people were kind of gearing up again for that day one tariff executive order, on January 20th. I think there was relief when it didn't happen. But in advance of that, companies really started looking at their supply chains. And they've been doing that for a while. But, trying to take a look at, can they diversify away from China? Folks have been trying to do that. I mean, the challenge is that takes time. It's not something that can be done overnight. It takes, months, if not years, to find a new supplier, make sure they are who they say they are. They can meet your needs as a company, capacity, quality, and everything else. But also making sure that, the country you're going to, do they have the sufficient infrastructure to handle kind of the increase in cargo flows? The roads, rails, are they adequate? Are the ports adequate? Can they handle the larger vessels? Do they get regular rotations? Things like that. So that all takes time to figure out, as well as doing your quality control and testing for, make sure things comply with U.S. law. The other piece too is that a lot of companies decided to try and front load as much as possible their products to get ahead of the tariffs. That's one of the reasons why you've seen kind of elevated imports since the end of last year, kind of through the summer. You've seen, higher import rates again, because folks are trying to get product in to get in front of the tariffs. Now, granted, towards the end of last year, you saw some of that because of the labor negotiations on the East Coast and Gulf Coast, where, we did go through a strike for a few days and then the threat of striking again in January. But so that added to that as well. But that was probably the biggest thing that folks were looking at, was front loading, getting as much product here as possible. Again, we ran into a challenge in April when the Chinese tariffs jumped up to 145%. So you saw Chinese trade drop significantly during that time frame. And then when that tariff was taken off and brought back down to 30%, you saw the trade take off again as folks were given this 90-day window to get stuff in as much as possible. Folks started to try to utilize bonded warehouses and free trade zones to hold product until they needed it. So, and that impacts your commercial real estate as folks are looking at, putting more and more stuff into warehouses. So that had an impact. Obviously, the bigger companies have more leverage and ability to do things like that, unlike smaller guys. One of the things, too, that we saw was that a lot of companies kind of absorbed the cost of the tariffs initially. Part of that is because there was the up and down and just the keeping it at about the 10% level. So companies were able to do that. But in doing that, it's hitting their bottom line. They're not able to further invest in their company, invest in their people, things like that. The smaller guys, don't have that ability. They can't absorb all that cost. So they've got to look at passing that along. And I think what you're going to start to see now, and you're already seeing this, is that you're starting to see inflation tick up again. You're starting to see prices rise again because companies are starting to pass along some of those costs. It's not a straight pass through because, companies are trying to figure out what will the consumer be able to absorb? How much more can they absorb? Can they work with their vendors overseas to see if they can get, better deals? But those costs get passed all the way through the supply chain.
They absolutely do. And part of the mitigation strategy also includes conversations that you and your team are having with legislators on Capitol Hill. As we record this episode, the government is still shut down. How does that impact your ability to mitigate in that way, having those conversations on behalf of the companies that you're representing in the retail sector?
Absolutely. That is a critical issue that we've been working on. I mean, that's one of our primary jobs as an advocacy organization, trying to educate lawmakers, administration, other public officials, and consumers about, the retail industry as a whole. One of the things that we've been doing is bringing in businesses to Washington, D.C. to educate lawmakers on the impact of the tariffs. We actually had a fly-in that was scheduled for April 2nd, Liberation Day, completely unrelated to the tariff announcement. It was planned months in advance just to talk about retail and small businesses and Main Street retailers. And we had to pivot very quickly because it was on the same day as the tariff announcement. So we did a press availability with some small retailers talking about the impact of tariffs on them before the president made his announcement, and then spent the whole next day up on Capitol Hill talking to lawmakers about the concerns and the impacts. And we've been doing that once a month since then. We've had 6 different fly-ins. We had our latest one last week where we brought in 15 small businesses to talk to legislators about the impacts they're feeling and impacts on their businesses, their employees, and their customers. You noted that the government is still in a shutdown. Even with the shutdown, staff are still up on Capitol Hill. So we had the ability to meet with staff. The Senate is still open and in business. So we had the opportunity to meet with some key senators as well in key committees. We've also brought folks in, both small and medium and large, to meet with key White House officials to talk about the tariffs and to make sure they fully understand how the tariffs work, how they apply to retail, what strategies retailers are using to mitigate. But the end of the day is that, it does get passed along to the consumer. They're trying to, suppress that as much as possible, but, it's going to happen. So making sure that legislators have the stories and can share those with the White House when they're looking for the impacts, what they're hearing from their constituents, which we think is critical. The other thing, too, is that it's not just about visiting in D.C., but it's, when the legislators are back home, making sure you're having conversations with them, bringing them into your facilities, your stores, your warehouses, and really explaining to them, this is what the tariff means to us. So they can visualize it and really see it and understand what those impacts are.
And that's a key thing that I really want our audience to hear is I had the opportunity to do my first call on Washington with TCA, the Truckload Carriers Association. And one thing that they said in prepping us is they said, the people that you're going to be meeting with today are going to be eager to meet with you because you're business owners, you're truck drivers, you are their constituents. They want to hear from you. They want to have conversations with you. And one thing that I just want to share with our audience is that was one of the most incredible experiences of my life is I actually had the opportunity to be there and I got to participate in a total of 7 meetings that day with my team And it included both sides of the aisle, the D's and the R's. And can I tell you, both sides were curious. They wanted to know what our opinion was. And we had thoughtful conversations throughout the day. And the day that we were there was the day the government shut down. And so we were walking, it was surreal. We were walking off of Capitol Hill with the staffers, and they're like, yeah, we'll see you tomorrow. Like, we're going to continue working. This isn't our first dance. We know this. And then as I exited Capitol Hill, there was this small noise that was just really, really loud. Well, when I saw it on the TV, it looked like something really big, and it was really tiny. And so being boots on the ground, what happened that day, and in my experience, was not what got projected out in the media. And so what I want to hear, I want people to hear what you're saying and what I'm saying. Get involved. Your legislators want to hear from you, and they'll have respectful conversations with you because they do desire to serve. And that was my experience on both sides. So not all the noise and chatter. We can make a difference with advocacy. Please get involved.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is critical that lawmakers hear from their constituents on what's happening on the ground. That's the only way that they learn. It's not intimidating, like some people think it might be, going up to Capitol Hill and you're, nervous meeting with a member of Congress. More likely you're going to meet with their staff. And, oh, by the way, the staff is probably some 20-year-old, but doesn't mean they're not important, because the staff are the ones who help inform the congressman, congresswoman about the issue and kind of where their constituents are. So again, you don't just have to do the advocacy in DC, but when they're back home, they all have district offices. They all have state offices. Invite them into your place of business and really sit down with them and explain to them and let them see what this all means. Coming to DC is great, but you don't have to do that to advocate. They'll all hold not all, but some will hold town hall meetings. Show up and participate. I know they can get a little rowdy with some other issues, but these are important issues that members need to hear from. Send an email, send a letter, do a phone call. There are multiple ways you can get engaged and talk to your members of Congress. It's really, really important they hear from you and understand what you're feeling, what you're seeing, and the impact on your business.
100%. And to your point about meeting with the staffers, oh my goodness, these are talented, knowledgeable, educated. I cannot say enough about this next generation of young professionals that are participating in government. Like they were just excellent to have conversations with. And so don't be deterred if they're young. Like it is not the stereotype that you might think. I found every conversation thoughtful. They were knowledgeable. They were well informed. They asked good questions. Also, if they had a difference of point of view than what we were presenting, they also shared, this is what my representative thinks on this issue. And it was just very respectful. Like, I can't say enough about it. And then to your point about getting involved at home, I got a text message yesterday from Senator John Cornyn saying, I'm holding a town hall meeting because, he
Great.
wants to show the constituents government shut down, but I'm working. And so when I got that text, I processed it a little bit differently because of my recent experience on Capitol Hill and just seeing the importance of advocacy and their openness to have conversations and their desire to hear from real business owners, real truck drivers, real, people that are in the supply chain handling safety. They want to talk to the people doing the work. And so I'm hammering this because I want our audience to hear their voice matters. And what one thing can you do to advocate or tell your story from your point of view to help them make better decisions, more informed decisions?
No, absolutely. And again, we've had a number of small businesses come to town who've never done it before. And the experience they've had is similar to what you described. they have now become some of our greatest advocates and are out there, talking to the press, talking to the media, talking to their friends and neighbors, and encouraging them to get engaged as well, organizing their own groups back at home for folks to go in and have those conversations as well. So it is an important part of this whole process.
It really, really is. And so when they first said that they're going to be eager to see you, I thought, oh, they're just talking us up because we're new. And then they genuinely were. So this is the reality. They're eager to have these conversations. So let's shift now to what's next. If there's one thing that we've learned, it's that tariffs don't disappear with a change in administration. Because, that's one of the questions as a business owner. If administration changes, is that going to change tariffs? So one side may add them, but the other rarely removes them. Why is that? I was surprised by this, John.
Yeah, so there are a number of different reasons. If you look back over the last two administrations, when President Biden ran, as candidate Biden, he talked about the harm of the tariffs from the first Trump administration. He talked about especially the retaliation, the impact on the farmers, and said that the tariffs are bad and they need to go away. Once he got into office, that didn't happen. The China tariffs stayed in place, and they actually increased them in some areas. Part of that is just the political pressure from different parties, different constituencies. Obviously, hearing from domestic industry, hearing from labor, being supportive of the tariffs, they kept those Chinese tariffs off. And, unclear what happens in the next election as to kind of who comes in and what their policies are going to be. The bigger question on tariffs in general is, why has Congress not stepped up? Because it is Congress's authority to deal with tariffs. That is, their deal is to be able to do things on tariffs. And Congress has been reluctant to take action, either last administration or this administration. Obviously, we've got the Supreme Court case right now oral arguments are scheduled for November 5th to talk about the legality of tariffs under what is known as IEEPA, the Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is how the president has put some of these tariffs into place. The administration has lost the two lower court decisions and is now to the Supreme Court to make a determination on to whether or not the IEEPA tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China and the reciprocal global tariffs are legal or not. If not, if the Supreme Court upholds those decisions, then the tariffs will be struck down. There's a question as to whether or not refunds will occur and how they will occur, and will it be easy or not for companies to get refunds. But we know the administration is going to look for other options for tariff authorities because this president likes tariffs. I mean, there's no question about that. They've got a variety of different authorities they can use, like the Section 232, those sectoral tariffs that we talked about. They've got things like Section 301, which are on countrywide tariffs. That's what we've done on China. There's now an investigation, 301 investigation on Brazil. And then they've got other tariffs they can use for what's known as balance of payments. It's Section 122. It's a little more limited because it's a cap of 15% for 150 days. And then they'd have to get congressional approval to keep those tariffs in place. I don't know that Congress in a midterm election is going to vote in favor of a tariff increase, but we'll see. Obviously, lots can depend upon the economy and everything else that's going on. So, tariffs are going to be here for a little while. And I think part of the challenge too, Ginger, one of the things we didn't talk about is just the revenue the tariffs raise and, how this administration views that revenue. When they talk about why tariffs, it's a variety of reasons. It's, the get out of China. It's a negotiating tool. And you look at what the president got this past week in Asia with the different agreements that were announced. It's bring manufacturing back to the United States. That's a laudable goal, but, what are we talking about? Are we talking about everything? Are we going to focus on kind of high-tech defense industrial base, which I think we'd all support? But we can't make everything here for a wide variety of reasons. And then that final piece is the revenue. And the tariffs are bringing in billions of dollars a month. The administration touts the record-breaking tariffs that are coming in every month. But again, they're not saying it's paid by U.S. importers. Notice it's a tax on U.S. importers, U.S. companies. So in the challenge that folks get addicted to the revenue. So, it's very difficult once tariffs are put in place to actually take them back off. We actually still have tariffs in place from the Smoot-Hawley era. it's just been very challenging to get some of those tariffs to come off, again, because of that revenue.
And my background is in education, and so I'm going to make a teacher analogy. When we talk about the government being addicted to the revenue, no matter which side of the aisle, and it's not likely that somebody's going to pick up the banner and cut that if they don't have to. Think about in our own individual checkbooks and savings accounts, as our income and earnings go up, are we likely to self-select and reduce our income? And so I think when we ask a question like that of ourselves, it helps us be more respectful and objective. It's not the boogeyman or the government. It's like, how can we have thoughtful conversations with other people trying to do their job and try to get these numbers brought down? Where are the points of consensus that are going to be better for the end user, for trucking, for all the people in the supply chain? And it comes from individual conversations and being a part of the process. So 2 words that I hear in everything we've talked about, and see if my 2 words land with you: continued uncertainty, no matter which way we go.
No, absolutely. There's so much still out there that we just don't know. And again, things can change on a daily basis, as we've seen. Whether it's new investigations that are coming up, a lot's going to depend upon what happens with the Supreme Court as well. What happens in the midterm elections next year, and what Congress will do, if they'll do anything. But just the ongoing uncertainty of what happens next on the tariffs. And, if country X decides to retaliate or say something not nice, do they end up with a higher tariff? It's unclear. And then how quickly those changes take effect as well is the challenge too. And that's the biggest part of the uncertainty, is just not knowing when these changes will occur, or how quickly they'll occur, knowing that this administration is really ramping up on enforcement on some of these issues as well. So making sure your customs compliance really is in lockstep, and you've got everything everything that's going on, and you can have a somewhat clean supply chain and understand all the risks that are out there.
Absolutely. And I can see the significance of your customs background before you made this transition. So again, the depth of knowledge that you bring to this. So as we wrap up, how should trucking and retail leaders prepare for this continued uncertainty?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is to try and continue to think forwards, look at how you are diversifying your supply chain, work with your vendor base. And that's not just the folks who are making your products, but your transportation providers as well. So they're fully up to speed on what your plans are, and they understand what's going to need to happen, especially as you have to be nimble and pivot quickly as some announcements are made. So I think that ongoing dialogue is really, really important, both inside the organization as well as outside with all of your supply chain partners. It's really important they fully understand what's at stake for your company, but also so they understand from the trucking perspective what it means for you as well. So that dialogue is really, really important.
It absolutely is. And so we've talked about the need for advocacy. What does that look like for everyday business owners, for drivers, for fleet managers?
Yeah, I think it's fairly simple. I mean, it sounds ominous and it's scary, but really it's getting engaged. It's as easy as sending an email to your member of Congress and letting them know what you're feeling. Engaging with different trade associations who are engaged with these issues. Most of them have different letter writing campaigns where you can sign your name to a letter, send your own letter. I know we have it here through NRF, an easy tool for companies to send their story to their member of Congress. Participate in the town halls, invite members of Congress and their staff into your facilities. Again, it's fairly easy. I think members of Congress love to go to facilities. It's great photo ops for them if you're willing to allow them to do that. But it's really important to get to know your member of Congress and make sure they understand the impacts, not just on the tariffs, but any of the issues they're working through, that they know what it is. So they can lean on you also when things are coming up before Congress, they'll reach out to you and say, hey, what do you think about this? How is this going to impact you? Is this good, bad, indifferent? It's important to get those relationships on the books.
It really is. And so one thing that I'd like to add as we wrap up is I have found the value in connecting with advocacy groups because like TCA, like the Retail Federation, you guys have already honed talking points that you know are likely to move the individual parts of the industry forward around things that we've got consensus on. And so the thing that I would say also is get involved with one advocacy group that is relative to your industry. And I think what you will find, like I did, is they've got clear talking points that then I'm in my business, running my business every day and doing the work. But when I set aside that day for advocacy, because we can all set a day or a half a day aside for advocacy or an evening for a meeting, those talking points make the meeting easier for me and also helps move the bigger picture forward. And they want to hear my perspective on that talking point. And so that's something we all can do. And there are tools to make that easy for each of us.
Yeah, I would just add, it's great to have the talking points, but really what they want to hear is kind of your own story. So you've got to make it, your own. They don't want to hear the spouted talking about, but it's like, what does this actually mean to me? Tell your story. That's what is most important for these folks, is that in your own words, what does it mean? The talking point can kind of get you to where you need to go, but really it's tell your story because they really want to hear from you on, what this means at the end of the day.
100%. So John, this has been insightful. Thank you for helping us see how something as complex as tariffs, it connects all the way from Congress to the consumer, which is every one of us.
No, absolutely, Ginger. I appreciate the opportunity to come on today and have the conversation. Certainly encourage everyone listening to stay informed, stay engaged, and speak up where you can. It's really important to be engaged.
Absolutely. So from the supply chain to the dinner table, tariffs touch every mile of American business. For more episodes like this, subscribe to the Hire Truckers podcast, and let's keep moving forward together.
Thank you for joining us today. Our goal with the Hire Truckers podcast is to provide industry insights, marketing trends, and motivation to level up your recruiting game. If we added value, take a few seconds to share this with your network. Have a great week.